Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be looking at the Dragon Sicilian. That's after the moves pawn to e4, pawn to c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c d4, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3. We're going to begin our Dragon Sicilian with the move pawn to g6. And we're going to be taking a look specifically at a line within the Dragon Sicilian where black opts for queen a5 instead of rook c8. So in the Yugoslav, after bishop e3, bishop g7, f3, castles, or actually in this case knight c6 is a slightly more accurate move order, but it's all getting to the same place. Knight c6, bishop c4, bishop d7, and we're going to have, after, say, either bishop to b3 or castle's queenside, we're going to have black play the move queen a5 and basically play chess this way. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button, click on your notification icon. So queen a5 in the Dragon, it's a slightly less respected move than rook a c8, but the idea is about the same. You want to play queen a5, and then you want to get this rook away from the f8 square and over to the c8 square. One of the things that I like about this variation is getting in queen a5 kind of early is a little bit of a success story on its own, because kind of what you're trying to do is you're trying to prevent this maneuver with knight d5 when you can't play queen takes d2 with check. So when you play the rook c8, knight e5 lines to get your exchange sack kind of locked and loaded on the c3 square, which is a little bit more well respected, later on when you play knight to c4, bishop c4, rook c4, it's difficult to play queen a5 in one go, because by then white will have played king b1 and can meet queen a5 with the move knight to d5, where he's taking on e7 and with check in between. So, you know, like for instance would be, let's say instead of queen a5, we have rook c8, bishop b3, knight c4, and let's say they go ahead and they insert king b1. Now after knight c4, bishop c4, rook c4, if they just continue straight forward with the move pawn to h4, you're not playing queen a5 in this position because it can be met with knight d5, and when you capture on g2, that is not with check, so they're going to be playing knight to e7. And they're going to be throwing this check in. So you need to get this rook away from the f8 square so that you can meet knight to e7 check with the move king to f8, and basically at that point knight to e7 would lose a piece. So that's kind of the idea behind the early queen a5, is if you get it in early, then you can get your support for getting your knight e5 and rook c8 in, so that you can sacrifice that exchange on c3 with the added queen a5 support without having to worry about this move knight to d5, because they haven't had time to play king to b1. So when you play queen a5 in this position, say bishop b3, rook f c8, now even if later on they play the move king to b1, knight d5 is still not a threat, because then when they play knight takes e7, you play king f8, and they have to spend a move to recapture your queen, and then you spend that move to capture their knight. So that's kind of why people play the queen a5 variation. So, you know, that being said, you've got to kind of, there are some issues with it. So the main issue with it is there's kind of two variations that you kind of have to be a little worried about. But the main variation that you have to be a little worried about is if you're spending this move playing queen a5, they do not really need to spend a move to play king b1. And that's kind of the most dangerous thing that you have to worry about. So that's what we're going to take a look at in this video, is like what happens if they don't play queen b1 when you're playing your queen a5 line. So that's going to be the main focus of this video. So you play queen a5, you play rook f c8, what happens when they don't play king b1? Because king b1 is by no means obligatory at this point, since knight d5 as an idea is clearly off. So we don't need to play king b1. We can just start operations with something like, say, h4 immediately, and just try to play h4-h5 or h4-g4, etc. So this is actually the most dangerous line that you can face as black when you're playing the queen a5, rook f c8 dragon. So we have knight e5, and then the most dangerous line is g4. Now against h5, there's a nice line here with this exchange sack, like rook c3, and then if they exchange queens, like queen c3, b3, knight h5, black has plenty of compensation for the material. This endgame, in my experience, it's probably slight edge black, but I think the computer gives it as pretty close to equal. So like g4, knight f6 is just equality, but I prefer kind of black's position. You know, you're going to play b5, you're going to play a5, you're going to play rook c8. It feels like it's much easier for black to improve his position than for white to improve his. And then, of course, the other line that can get played here is they can leave queens on the board. They can play bc3 And then after knight takes h5, that'll probably be the subject of another video because this can lead to some pretty wild complications, but needless to say, black is doing okay in these lines as well. He has compensation for the exchange. He sacrifices the exchange and gets a pawn, and white has an attack, but black also has a pretty dangerous attack. So g4, this is the most dangerous move. g4-h5, we don't have the option to sacrifice the exchange and then win a pawn. So now b5 is a move. Interestingly enough, another move that is worth serious consideration, just because of the nature of the dragon and the nature of needing to sacrifice an exchange at some point for defensive reasons, it's actually possible to sacrifice an exchange without gaining the pawn. And it's not at all clear that this is a bad idea. It's probably a-okay for black to do this, because once you eliminate the possibility of the knight going to d5, the odds of you getting checkmated goes down pretty significantly, because you cannot ever get rid of this knight. You can't really dislodge this knight on the f6 square without doing something that will slow down your attack even more. Like if you play g5, this knight goes to h5 and just blocks everything up forever and ever. So you don't have a good way to get rid of the knight once the exchange gets sacked. This is a defensive exchange sacrifice. So once you make this defensive exchange sacrifice, and then even if white exchanges queens, it's very unclear that black is significantly worse here. Actually, the position is probably just unclear, or possibly just equal. So like, for example, rook c8, king b2, you could play a5, a3, and then something like h5. And this position should be acceptable for black. This should be fine. So this is another direction that you can go if you have problems with this other line that I'm about to give. So this other line is the more dangerous line. It's b5, and then we have h5. So now here, the move knight to c4 is a serious lemon. Like, you don't want to play this move because white's attack simply lands first. And again, it comes back to that idea of knight d5 down the road. So like after takes, we're opening up the b file and we're trying to get traction. But after, say, hg6, fg6, queen h2, the threat is now knight d5. And we're not hitting his queen side fast enough or hard enough to get there first. So after, say, rook ab8, knight d5 should be completely winning for white. Knight takes d5, ed, queen a2 is going to be too slow. White's getting to the king side before black gets to the queen side. And more importantly, white can simply run with his king once we start checking him. He can simply run with his king to the king side, and white should be completely safe. Meanwhile, after, I don't know, some black move, we'll just say a4, bishop h6, black should be completely lost here. So this is a completely losing position for black. White's position should be completely decisive. So knight c4 is a serious lemon, even though it's normally a pretty natural move. And interestingly enough, if the king had been on b1, like if white had wasted one extra tempo with king b1, knight c4 is a perfectly sound move. So like if we insert the moves rook ab8 and king b1, now knight c4 is probably acceptable. That one extra move would make all the difference in the world. But without that extra move, we're going to have to play the move pawn to b4 here. This is the only move. And now I'm going to give you some of my super advanced opening preparation. I had an old line that I played way back in the day, back when computers were young and the preparation was inaccurate. After the move knight d5, I had actually prepped the line knight d5, bishop d5, and then kind of the move that I came up with without a ton of engine assistance, and the engines that I was using were quite weak, was the move e6, which the idea was to sacrifice the rook on a8, but also to make a place for my king to run with king f8 and king e7. It turns out with modern engines that this move is actually unsound. They certainly cannot take the rook on a8, that much is clear. If they do take the rook on a8, this is a blunder, and black of course wins after knight c4. White has to sacrifice the queen. If white moves the queen, then white's getting mated with queen a2, queen a1. So this was like the original trap. But as it turns out, it's actually just a bad idea to move this pawn, because after e6, when they simply retreat, or more to the point, like if they can actually throw in hg6, and then retreat. After knight c4, bishop c4, rook c4, they can actually ignore everything. Like I thought king b1 was obligatory. It's apparently not. They can just play queen h2. So I thought there was some obligation to defend this pawn on a2. I thought maybe queen a2 would come, and there was some obligation to defend it, but there's no obligation to defend it. They can just jump on everything right away with this move queen h2, and apparently this should be decisive advantage white. So this is something that you have to be very, very concerned about. So instead of that, the line that you need to play is you need to not play e6, because apparently the weakness on d6 is kind of a big deal. So what you need to do is you need to play knight c4 first. So then bishop c4, rook c4, and now there is an obligation to defend on a2 at some point. They can still throw in hg6, but now if queen a2, now black is getting a huge advantage here. So if they throw in hg6 without playing king b1, you are playing queen a2, and actually here black has enough, like rook a c8, queen takes, and now they have to play very precisely just to survive. Like if they were to play g takes f7, rook c2 is winning, because if the knight ever has to move, queen b2 is coming at some point, and then this is going to be mate. So we have this mating net here. So they have to do, really they have to do something else. Like after king f8, they have to try to defend, and then this is all supposed to peter out into a perpetual. You have bishop a4, ratcheting up the pressure, and then they can play bishop h6, threatening mate themselves. And then after all this stuff happens with check, apparently black doesn't quite have enough to win, but he does have a perpetual check with queen c5 and queen e5. So this whole sequence allowing queen takes a2 is apparently not good. So instead of hg6, they do have this obligation in this case to play king b1, and then you can throw in the move queen e5. And queen e5 is a really thematic move. It gets the queen out of the way of this eventual pawn push with a5, a4, but it also gets the queen on the same diagonal as this bishop and sets up a tactic against b2, which makes it very, very difficult for this knight on the d4 square to ever move. So this is really critical. So the main critical idea here is apparently to at some point play rook a c8 and just play d5, and that's to increase the communication or to break the protection of this bishop on e3 so that you can play bishop a4 and ratchet up the pressure on c2 without b3 being a possibility. So basically the idea is, like, say after queen d3, we would play rook a c8, hg, fg in this case, because we need to slow down this attack as much as possible. So we're going to play fg, and it also leads to the possibility of redeploying this bishop to this diagonal, which we didn't really have a way to do that earlier. We didn't have an option to play something like bishop e8, f7 at some point. So now that option exists. So fg is something that we try in these positions from time to time, just to kind of free up the f7 square for the bishop, but also to make it a little bit harder to mate us over here. It just takes a smidge longer to break through. We have moves that we can throw in the way like h5 at some point if we need to. So we have rook d2 protecting the c2 square. Now if you don't protect the c2 square, there can be issues, because now we are actually threatening rook c2, and again we can't have this knight move like knight c2, queen b2 is coming. So that's a huge problem. So we have rook d2, and now d5 should be completely equal. So for example, d5, e takes d5, we're increasing that communication, then we're going to play bishop a4. So here's the big idea, is there is no pawn to b3 here, because we have rook c3, which is going to be hitting the bishop on e3 via x-ray, which we didn't have a move ago, because the pawn on e4 was defending that bishop. Another thing this does is it ratchets up the pressure on c2, forcing white into a defensive posture. So if white plays an attacking move, for example, again, this idea is going to be on with just capturing on c2 a whole bunch of times until eventually white is going to be forced to recapture with a knight, and then queen b2 is made. So they have to just defend everything with rook on h to h2, and then you can play queen takes d5, b3, rook c3, queen e2, and then bishop goes back to e8. This is the critical idea. We're going to bring that bishop to f7 at some point, and black is doing really, really well here. Actually, this position should be considered unclear, possibly even slight edge black. Like, black is actually doing really, really well here in this position, and this is probably the way black should be playing this position from the critical moment. So if we go back to this position, the only other possibility is to retreat this knight to e2, and then we're just going to basically play a similar idea, which should be also acceptable. We should play knight c4, takes. Again, they're going to have to throw in this king b1. They can't allow queen takes a2. We're going to play rook a c8, which is very natural. hg6, again, fg6, rook c1, and again, kind of this critical idea here, bishop e8. This is the critical idea. Threaten to redeploy your bishop to f7. Also threaten to redeploy your knight to d7. And just basically make all these squares available for your pieces. Make it possible to play queen a4. Make it possible to shuffle this rook back to c5 and a4. And just ratchet up the pressure against white's queen side by making every single piece in this position have some sort of natural square. So like a possible line would be something like knight b3. We would play queen a4. Again, very natural, threatening rook c6, a6, also threatening bishop f7 or knight d7 to improve. g5, again, whenever they play g5, we stop things up with knight h5, slow down that attack as much as possible. And then say knight on d to b4. We would have, there's a fork threat here, so we would have to retreat, but now we're also threatening rook to a5, and we're also threatening at some point to ratchet up the pressure more with the move bishop to f7 and start building up a huge attack against the a2 square and against white's queen side. Black should have plenty of compensation for whatever's going on here. As a matter of fact, I think this position might even just be slight edge black. So that's how we play the queen a5 line when black does this extremely straightforward plan of just playing h4 and g4 without castling. So if we go back here, when he plays h4 and g4 and all of this stuff, I mean after castling but without playing king b1, without wasting that tempo to play king b1 in the queen a5 lines, I believe that this is the best line to play against this. You need to play pawn to b4, and you need to go down this particular path, and you need to play these exact moves. And in these cases, I think black is more than okay. I think the position is at least equal, and in some cases, you can possibly even say that the position might be slight edge black if everything is played perfectly. So anyways, I hope you found this position helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use a lot of these ideas in your own games. And thank you very much for watching.